Hello, fellow Star Trek fans. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Clonestar Podcast with me, your host, Mike Overton. I am joined once again by my wonderful friend, Jodi. Jodi, how are you doing this week?
Doing great, Mike. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, this week we are joined by a writer and producer on both Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise. This week's guest has helped shape some of the most memorable, thought-provoking stories of the era, including fan favorites like Author Twilight and In a Mirror Darkly. Outside of Star Trek, his career spans an impressive range of television from 12 Monkeys to The Last Ship to Legend of the Seeker and Threshold, showcasing his passion for science fiction and strong character-driven storytelling. Today, we'll be talking about his journey through the Trek universe, the craft of writing great speculative fiction, and how to keep pushing boundaries in a franchise that's been boldly going for nearly 6 decades. Mike Sussman, welcome to the Clonestar Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. So, let's start right at the very, very beginning. When you were growing up, what kind of stories did you like as a kid?
I like stories about superheroes and spaceships. I was pretty young when I discovered Star Trek on television, and so it really was kind of a formative uh, concept for me. And I remember drawing my own comic book stories. The very first story I can recall drawing was a few panels. It was a very short comic book about the Enterprise crashing into an asteroid and blowing up. And I remember I was so proud of it, and I put the panels up that I'd drawn in our basement, where absolutely nobody could see them. So yeah, I mean, I was someone who was heavily influenced by Spider-Man, Batman. Those were the comics. Those were the TV shows I really loved. Ultraman. I don't know if Ultraman is still a thing. There wasn't a whole lot to watch during that era of the 70s and 80s, or there wasn't quite so much science fiction and fantasy being produced. And what was being produced was not the highest quality. So yeah, I've always had an interest in that sort of genre, science fiction, fantasy, comic books.
So you said you started writing, you'd make your own comic books. Was writing something you kind of caught the bug on early?
Yeah, I think so. I would write short stories for extra credit in English class. I think I probably thought I would, for a period of time, either become a novelist or write short stories for a living, as if that seemed like something you could make a career at. I remember, so when I was a teenager, I subscribed to like Analog and Asimov science fiction, and would write really cliched short stories and send them off and wait for that inevitable rejection letter. So that was really the direction I thought I would be going. And yeah, sometime in my teens, I caught the TV and film bug. I had already been a fan of this, but you don't necessarily, as a young person, put together the obvious notion that television shows and movies are written and that writers are required. Whereas with a short story or a novel, the author's name is right there on the cover along with the title and nobody else's. So I guess when that thought had dawned on me, I started thinking more and more about movies and television, and particularly the type of shows and movies that I loved. Obviously, Star Wars had certainly come out by this point, and science fiction was undergoing something of a boom period in the '80s. And Star Trek was very much a thing again, at least on the big screen, and was ultimately coming back to television. I remember. I think it was 1986. Gene Roddenberry was doing the lecture circuit at various colleges all over the country, and he was speaking at a college not far from me. And a friend of mine got tickets. We went to go see him, and there was actually this VIP event after for like I can't remember how much we paid, where you could shake his hand to get your picture taken with him and chat with him in a more intimate environment. I think there were maybe like 20 or 30 people there, and he just kind of held court, which was really nice. But before that, he was in this big lecture hall, and he showed us, of course, the cage, the pilot, which I think was something he did on his lecture tour. And he told the crowd at the end of the pilot that, and this was like the summer of '86, so it was like right before Voyage Home came out.
Yeah.
And I think the studio knew that they had a big hit on their hands, and they wanted more Star Trek. And he told us in the audience that he was, in the next week or so, going back to Paramount. They wanted to talk to him about bringing Star Trek back to television. And I was just like, that's amazing. It had been certainly 20 years since the original show had been on. The idea that we'd ever get Star Trek on a weekly basis again seemed kind of crazy. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know how or when, but someday I'm going to write for that show. That's going to be
Nice.
that's going to be my and I moved to LA many years later, and by that time I think I moved to LA just as Next Gen was wrapping up, and heard about an internship program that they'd had ongoing on all of the shows, and I'd learned about this from I guess one of your previous guests. Well, Brannon and Ron Moore had a writer's workshop that they did at a convention in Pasadena. And I signed up for that. I was new to LA, an aspiring writer, had zero connections to the industry. And I think Lolita Faccio was working with them at the time on that. They were working on the show together, but she was also working with them on their workshop. And there was discussion of an internship program. And I thought, internship program, well, I'm going to apply for that. And I did, and I took some of these scripts that I'd written over the last few years and submitted them. And I think about a year later, I got a phone call saying, "You wrote a pretty good script. How do you feel about doing a 6-week internship with the writing staff of Voyager? With this new show, we're just starting up." I was like, "Fantastic!" So that was sort of my cradle to grave in terms of Star Trek up anyway. Where it all started. I guess it's funny because it started even earlier in that as a very young person, I recall Star Trek being on 6 days a week and not understanding anything about television production. For all I knew, Star Trek was like The Young and the Restless, where they would just make an episode a day and you get 5 new ones every. I didn't realize the show was already in reruns. And on Saturdays, there was the animated series was being rerun. So I was just terribly spoiled watching 6 brand new episodes of Star Trek every week, just thinking, "Oh, this is great. This is going to go on forever." And then ultimately they start rerunning, and you hit the sad reality of what
I've seen this
show wasn't in production anymore. But so yeah, that's where I started, and that took me all the way out to LA and to writing for Voyager.
So, what was your first official writing credit on Star Trek?
That was an episode, I think a season 2 episode of Voyager called Meld. That was a story that I had sold to Michael Piller, who was the showrunner of Voyager, the co-creator, along with Jerry Taylor and Rick Berman. And so I'd been on the show as part. I'd had this 6-week internship on the show with the writing staff, sitting in on all the writers' meetings, taking notes, writing on the board as the showrunner or the executive producer at the time. Sometimes it was Jerry, sometimes it was Michael, would dictate the beats of a particular episode. And you as the intern would write those beats on the board, and all the writers would chime in. And Michael had put out to the writing staff, even before I had gotten there, he wanted to do, back in the day, they had to do 26 episodes a season. They had to service all of the characters. And Michael really wanted to do, he had a theme for a story. He wanted to do a story about senseless violence, and he wanted that story to be about Tuvok. He wanted a story about Tuvok trying to grapple with the senseless nature of violence. And he had no story, and he put it out to the writing staff, and as I recall, people were bringing him stories that had that theme that just didn't work for him. And on the last day of my internship, I had a meeting with Michael, just kind of summing everything up, and he said, "Is that all you got?" And I said, "Well, actually, I have a story idea," and I pitched him an idea about an alien serial killer mind melding with Tuvok rather, mind melding with an alien serial killer, and how it sends Tuvok off the rails. And I remember Michael, he leaned back in his chair and was looking at the ceiling during my pitch, and I thought he's daydreaming. He's like
he's zoned out. He's not interested.
He's zoned out. He's like making a list of what he needs to do the rest of his day. And then he stopped looking at the ceiling, and he was totally unreadable. I had no idea what he was going to say. And he said, "I've never heard an idea like that before," which was amazing. And so that was like the Friday, the last day of my internship. And so I was done being an intern. The following Monday, I was back in the office as a freelance writer because they were buying the story. And that turned into a pretty memorable episode for Tim Russ and for Tuvok. I ended up just writing the story document, which was, I don't know, 10 or 12 pages at the time. And Michael wrote the teleplay. They were really under the gun. They were behind on scripts. And I was a kid, basically. They could not afford to give me that script. In all likelihood, I would need a lot of hand-holding in the rewriting process, and they just didn't have the time for it. So Michael took the story, and I think he wrote the script in like 5 days. And he really turned it into something of a little minor classic for Voyager. Brad Dourif played the Betazoid crew member quite memorably, who then became not a regular character, but I think we saw him in the season finale. He and the Doctor helped save the ship. What I really liked about that story and the way it turned out is that it was the kind of story you could really only do on Voyager. Whereas first of all, having like a Maquis crewman who was capable of murder, you wouldn't have that on Next Gen. You won't even have that really on Deep Space Nine. And now you're stuck with this crewman. You can't drop them off anywhere, and so they're stuck in your brig all the time. So it felt like a very unique type of story for that particular show. And as I worked on Enterprise later, it can be a real challenge to come up with a story, to write a story that can really only be done on that show, that is kind of perfect for that show and not any of the others. And that was generally the sign of that you found like writer's gold. You found a really great story that can only be told with these characters in this situation. So I think that's one of the reasons that story works so well. But yeah, I have to hand it all to Michael Piller, who was just so ready to write that, and he just needed an idea that worked. And I was lucky enough to be the person who came up with it.
So, I mean, how did it feel then? Yeah, absolutely. How did it feel then, looking at the credits and seeing your name on the credits of a Star Trek show?
I mean, it was the coolest thing ever. I mean, having been a fan for so long, and really moved out to LA with the objective of writing for that franchise, which was, really in full swing in the early 90s, the mid 90s. You had 2 television shows on the air. Both shows were doing 26 episodes a season. So that's 52 hours of Star Trek that they were producing on the Paramount lot. And I
wish we could go back to those days.
well, the thing is, they needed stories. You couldn't, even if you had I can't remember how large the writing staff was. It was a relatively small writing staff, but you just simply could not come up with enough good stories. So what was wonderful about all of the shows, and a lot of this was due to Michael Piller inviting a lot of non-writers, non-professional writers to come in and pitch ideas. Yes, it was lovely of him to do that and give people like me and other writers like me their shot, but it was really born out of desperation and just not having enough great standalone stories. And it's a little sad that the business model has changed and that doesn't exist anymore, because I think it's now so much harder to break in. Had those shows not been making, if they'd been making, 20 episodes a season between two series, say doing 10 each, your writing staff could come up with all those stories. You only need one or two stories from each writer for a year, and you're done. So there's no need for outside writers to come in. There's no need to give anybody their break, and it's unfortunate. It really is.
You don't have the responsibility also of developing characters to the extent that they had to throughout, the longer seasons. So, but I do think with Meld, that's quite a breakthrough. I mean, that's an episode that makes a lot of top 10 lists when it comes to Voyager.
Absolutely.
Not just because of the storyline for Tuvok, but like you said, because it was such a unique storyline that could really only be told on Voyager, that was free from the Federation's, kind of there to lean on. So well done. Well, that was a great episode to break in.
Yeah, it's hard for me not to throw all that credit at the late Michael Piller, who really had a vision for that episode. It's fortuitous. It's probably a very good thing that he ended up writing it, because I would not have been able to, at least at that point in my life, been able to craft the story that he did. But it was I couldn't have asked for sort of, I guess, a better introduction to that universe. And I remain a little bit proud of it.
Yeah, you should. Absolutely.
Did you have a favorite character to write for on Voyager?
I loved writing for the Doctor. I really did. I liked writing for the Doctor.
That's everybody's answer. And
I liked writing for Seven, because Seven was the outsider. The Doctor was the outsider too. He just sort of didn't know it. It was always fun for him to realize that he was sort of different. And so many years later, I'd sold some freelance stories over a few seasons, and then came on staff with my writing partner Phyllis for season 7 of Voyager, and they gave us a story. They bought a script, or they bought a story from some outside writers, and they were not happy with how the draft turned out, and so they gave that script to me and to Phyllis to rewrite, and it was a Doctor and a Seven story. Body and Soul was the and it was this very lighthearted but ultimately very meaningful episode for the Doctor, and it was kind of a tour de force for Jerry Ryan, who basically for much of the episode is playing the Doctor, and was really just hysterical in it, and did such a bang up job. And it's funny because I do think of it as a Doctor story more than a Seven story, but she also has her own arc in that story where she realizes she's not
she likes
really
cheesecake. No,
she likes cheesecake, as we've seen in the memes.
Oh my gosh!
So many of those.
I have a whole story about that cheesecake that I probably shouldn't get into. I'm still bitter about it.
Oh.
All right, I have to tell you now.
Go on. You said it now. You said it now.
So I went down to the set because I'd heard that the department
cheesecake.
They had cheesecake for everybody. They had giant, platters for everybody, and I was busy working on another script. By the time I got down there was nothing but crumbs. There was not one piece of cheesecake left, and nobody bothered to save cheesecake for the writer. 25 years later, and I still remember this.
But you're not bitter in any way, are you?
So now it'd be great if I had a piece of cheesecake here. Now I'm addicted to cheesecake.
Cheesecake.
If you're at Vegas next year, I will buy you some cheesecake.
Cheesecake.
Actually, candy.
Sorry, you'll have to say that again. You broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said I really don't eat cheesecake much these days, but I appreciate the thought.
We'll buy cake. Any cake you want, you can have cake.
Okay.
You talked a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you go, Jodi. You go.
You talked a little bit about the collaborative process that you had, with some of the writers there. Can you talk a little bit about what the writers' room was like on Voyager? Because, we talked earlier about how we've spoken to Kenneth Biller, and we spoke to Lisa Klink, and just curious about what your take is on the Voyager writer room.
Well, I mean, it was the most incredible writing school you could ever imagine being in. Certainly, even as a freelancer, you get invited into the room and work with all the writers and the producers to develop your story, and it was just this brain trust of all these incredible minds who had created modern Star Trek by and large. And it was, so on the one hand, it was like incredibly intimidating to be in that room with those people, but they were also super kind and super nice, and they were all rooting for you and your story. You may come in as a freelancer. So, for instance, I had sold a story in, I guess it was season 6, that became a two-parter, a Unimatrix Zero. And so I basically sold them a concept about like the Borg and a rebellion in cyberspace. And there wasn't much more than that. I'd had a take on it, but they kind of didn't like my take. So I came back, and I thought I was just going to be meeting with either Ken Biller or Brannon and maybe Joe Manansky. And I went into Brannon's office, and the whole Voyager writing staff was there. And I was just like, blah. I was like a deer in headlights. And I had 3 versions of this, like how you could make that into an episode. And the first one didn't work. The second one was too much like something else. And then I pitched the third one out, and they were all kind of like, And I just remember like the thrill of that moment, being in the room with these people whose work I'd so admired, seeing that they saw the possibilities in it. And more than that, they ended up turning it into a 2-parter, and it was a season-ending cliffhanger, which is like the hardest thing in the world to sell to these folks, because they generally they know what they're doing for their cliffhanger. They know what their season ender is going to be. But I had inadvertently sold it to them. The problem was it's such a big thing. They liked the idea too much. I'd done my job too well because I wanted to write it, but because it was going to be the cliffhanger, they were going to write it. Right. And instead they gave me a story that had been kind of troubled, called ultimately it was called The Haunting of Deck 12. Yep. And it actually ended up being kind of a fun little Neelix story, a little Neelix ghost story. But when they gave it to me, it was not a Neelix ghost story. It was very unclear what it was, and it was like episode 25 of 26 in that season. And so I witnessed sort of firsthand what it was like to meet with writers who had just made 24 episodes of Star Trek and were really very burned out and just didn't quite know how to make this story. There was something there they knew they liked, but so it was and that ended up being a very troubled script that they ended up doing a lot of work on. But the one element that I had brought to that story, I felt, was the Neelix part of it. And they ended up rewriting it around Neelix. And it ended up being, I thought, like a very fun little story ultimately in the end. But I really wanted to write that Borg story, and was disappointed that I did not do that.
So I tell you, brought him some serious big ideas. I mean, the big episodes came from your pitches.
Well, I suppose, but Meld was a very, it was really one guest star. It all took place on the Voyager set, so that must have been a relatively cheap episode. So you just really don't know. I mean, you'll have an idea for something, and it's a budget buster, and don't you have an idea, and it's 2 people in a room, and you can write. That's what's so wonderful about Star Trek. All of the different genres that you can plug into. The show was a bit like an anthology show in some ways. You could do a comedy one week, you could do a prison drama the week after, an action adventure episode. You got to work out all of your writing muscles on that show. And you found out very quickly what your weaknesses were, and that process of working with that room, those writers who had been through a lot of the same things, for instance, Brandon he's very much a horror guy, and I enjoy horror, but I've never necessarily been drawn to writing it. But I found he was able to help me in those areas. Years later, I ultimately did a Borg story for Enterprise that was very much a take on The Thing and who goes there, that I think ended up as a pretty good episode ultimately. But a lot of that, again, I have to credit Brandon for teaching me the horror of it and how it's often more scary to not show something than it is to actually show it.
So I tell you what, on that subject of Enterprise, then let's shift this over to Enterprise. You became a producer and a kind of a major creative voice during Enterprise's run. What changed in your approach between Voyager and Enterprise?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure actually what changed. I think I changed in that I think I gained a certain level of confidence. So my partner and I came in on the staff as like story editors on Voyager in season 7, and literally a few months later, those writers moved on to other things for the most part, and Enterprise started up, and a whole brand new crop of writers were brought in, hired by Rick and Brandon for this new show that they saw as being very character focused. So they looked for people who weren't necessarily science fiction writers, but could write great characters and had great character scripts, great sample scripts. So I went from being the new guy on the block with my writing partner, being shown the ropes, to just a few months later, we were now the veterans, and all the new writers were looking to us as to we were the Rick and Brandon whisperers. Are they going to like this? Are they going to like that? Would you read this before I turn it in? So that was a bit of a twist and a turn, and but it was a lot of people went through that revolving front door in season 1 and 2 of Enterprise. All terrific writers, many of whom went on to win Emmys and get all sorts of nominations and acclaim. But it was a difficult show to write for, in that Rick and Brandon were trying to reinvent the show. We're trying to reinvent the franchise and do it in a different way. And some of which would click with people, some of it didn't. I think ultimately what we found, it was more important than probably any of us realized to hire writers who had a stronger grasp of Trek, of how it works, of the canon, what shows had been told. I mean, there were certainly in season 1 a lot of writers were pitching stories that had already been done to one degree or another on Next Gen and Voyager and Deep Space. So, and they were simply unaware of that because they just weren't that familiar with it. But that's one of the reasons they were hired, because they didn't know that. So ultimately, that wasn't a super successful strategy for hiring a writing staff. Of course, I spent many years watching all of the shows because I was pitching to Deep Space and to Voyager. And what was so wonderful about there being 2 shows, I had a story about it was a Dr. Bashir story and a prisoner. It was about a prisoner, and Bashir did neurosurgery on that prisoner, who was a very violent person, sort of had shadows of Meld actually. And in correcting the deficiencies in the neurology of this alien prisoner, this prisoner became healthy again and no longer wanted to kill, and was basically no longer the same person that they had been when they had killed. And this was actually loosely based on a real life story of a killer who had repented. And I found a sci-fi twist for it. So I pitched it to Deep Space, and I didn't sell it, but I literally walked across the hall to Voyager and ended up selling it to them.
And you did sell it to them.
I did sell it to them, and that was done. I didn't write the teleplay for that one. I think it was called, maybe it was Repentance. I'm not sure. Rob Doherty, I believe, wrote that one.
I can't remember now.
but it was a season seven
It's a
episode.
uh,
And it became instead of a Dr. Bashir story, it became a Seven of Nine story where she used her
yes,
nanotechnology to
Repentance, episode 12.
repent. And so yeah, it was again, they had so many slots to fill. It was a tiny bit frustrating in that I was selling them stories that I felt a passion about writing, but those stories were handed off to other writers to develop. And it was a little it was quite a little while before I was able to take like my own story beginning to end. And I think that's something as I've gone on to, work as an executive producer on shows. I try and let a writer continue with the story they came up with because it can be very jarring to be given something that you don't necessarily have a feel for, and to pull it away from the writer who might have originated it. Now, if the person who came up with the idea is not a script writer or hasn't proven themselves, then they can't do it. You can't really, more often than not, you don't have the time to risk giving them that script assignment. But I don't know. I think part of it was just the way things kind of fell, and not that there was any intention behind it. But I was I was I felt on Enterprise as opposed to Voyager, I was finally getting a chance to write stories that I was coming up with, or me and my writing partner were coming up with, and I felt those episodes I had more of an ownership over, but more of an enthusiasm for, because
It's your story.
I knew what I wanted them to be.
Yeah.
They were ours.
Yeah.
So kind of on that note then, obviously you co-wrote Twilight, which was originally, am I right in thinking, written for Voyager, but then was used in Enterprise?
Well, it was a pitch. It was like I think a page-long pitch for Voyager, and it had kind of the same trappings of a interrograde amnesia type story, which was made quite famous and popular in Memento, and finding a sci-fi reason for it. And I think it was just sort of too big a story. I mean, obviously, in the Enterprise version of it, there are apocalyptic ramifications of the story. The Voyager story wasn't quite so apocalyptic, but it did tell a story going, 10, 20 years into the future between Janeway and Chakotay. And I think they felt they'd done they'd done what they wanted to with those two in terms of relationship, and certainly Chakotay and Seven of Nine were starting to become a thing. So I think for a whole bunch of reasons, that story was not going to work on Voyager at that time. And I just kind of forgot about it for quite a while. And then when season 3 of Enterprise rolled around, I realized I still had this idea in my back pocket. Well, who could I do it for? What was ironic is that at that point in the show's run, the decision had been made to basically pair up Trip and T'Pol. And now I'm coming in with this story that is really a sort of tender, unrequited love story between T'Pol and Archer. And it didn't quite fit in with what we were intending to do, but that was really the only way the story worked. There was no way to swap out those characters, and we did it, and we did it, and I think that it ended up being a very sweet story for the two of them, with this apocalyptic background going on, which obviously heightened the stakes for that entire season as to these aliens, the Xindi that had attacked Earth. What were their true intentions? How far were they going to go? We got to see very early on because Twilight we ended up shooting and writing as episode 8, and that was, I think, so season 3 we did 24 episodes, and I remember pitching the story and writing it, developing it with Rick and Brannon, and Rick really wanted to find a way to hold the story to later in the season. I think he felt it was just kind of too soon to be going so apocalyptic. And I understood that, but again, in the crush of production, it's like you kind of go with the ideas that you have, and you find a way to make it work. And I think it was actually kind of better for that story arc to do Twilight earlier, because it showed you what would happen if Archer and his crew failed and the results of it. So I think to have done that at the end, you could have done it at the end, but it really set up the stakes for everybody, all the characters in a way that had been missing to a certain degree. It wasn't quite clear how far the Xindi would go. Were they going to come back and, carve off Florida entirely? I grew up in Florida, so I enjoyed watching that.
If only that was in real life. No, I'm joking.
But I remember working on that episode and trying to imagine what the final Xindi attack would be and what kind of ship they would send. And I remember thinking, are they going to blow up the planet? Is that too much? Is that too much like the Death Star? Can we do that? And I just wrote it. Okay, they blow up the Earth. That's the teaser. And that was what we stuck with, which was amazing. It's probably the favorite teaser I've ever gotten to write for any show. How often you get to destroy the planet Earth.
Right.
And I think it's not really
stuff, right?
Yeah, I know we'd certainly never seen it in Star Trek. I think there had been some alternate times where like the sun blew up or something, but we hadn't quite seen it to that degree. And the VFX artist just did an amazing job, I thought. But and all that stuff is fun, the action adventure and the stakes. But it was really, for me, the heart of it was that touching little love story where T'Pol has. I mean, it's 50 First Dates is what it was, which came out a couple of years later. And I think really ruined the episode to a certain degree for some people. I still can't watch 50 First Dates, but that's basically what she went through, falling in love with a man who doesn't remember her.
I never thought of that connection to 50 First Dates. Now I'll never see the episode the same. My gosh, all right.
I know. I just ruined one of my better episodes. Sorry about that.
Well, we have to also talk about In a Mirror Darkly, because that's such a beloved alternate universe episode and story in Trek. I mean, we love our alternate universe, in general, but
who doesn't?
This one's definitely a standout, right? So how did that one come about? Where'd the concept for this one?
Well, I mean, it was just born out of my nerddom and just hanging on to various pieces of trivia. I only found out recently or read that I guess Deep Space Nine had developed a story at some point involving the finding of the Defiant. Now, I don't know what that story was. I don't believe it was a mirror universe story of any kind, and they ended up not doing it. But I was, as a huge fan of the original series, very much aware that there was this ship, this Constitution class ship that was just floating out there, whose fate had never been resolved. So I pitched a story in season 2 that we ended up doing. Called Future Tense, where the Enterprise finds this sort of time pod from the future that Tholians are after, and there's a dead humanoid inside who turns out to be somebody who has a lot of different DNA from different species that Phlox has never seen before, and this is a person from the future. And it's kind of the Enterprise is playing keep away from the Suliban and the Tholians and the other people in the Temporal Cold War who want to get their hands on this advanced ship from the future, which Mike, you probably would appreciate was a nod to the TARDIS from Doctor Who, if you remember. One of the big issues was the ship couldn't be very big. We had to build it. We had to put it in our shuttle base set. So what was going to be so cool about it? And I borrowed quite heavily from Doctor Who, and I thought, well, it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. We certainly haven't seen that before. And that was a fun little reveal. And so I enjoyed that element of it. But so originally, though, they weren't going to find a little time pod from the future. They were going to find a Federation starship. They were going to find the Defiant that had disappeared, and Archer and his crew would have to get involved and make sure that this ship didn't fall into the wrong hands. And I think Brandt had pointed out, well, I mean, even when I pitched it, I knew it was going to be a hard sell. how much of this ship could we afford to even build for one episode? Could we even have our crew go aboard it? Aren't they now sort of seeing their own future or the future of the Federation? It was very problematic, which I kind of knew, but I was still hoping that they would greenlight it. So we just changed it to another type of ship from further in the future, and the story ended up, I think, working kind of nicely. But I still had this idea. The Defiant was still out there, and so season 4 rolls around, and Manny Cotto is now running the writers' room, and one of the one of the two-parters that he had sort of carved out space for in that season was going to be a mirror universe story. We didn't quite know what it was. And then there was a much longer story about William Shatner potentially appearing on the show, which I'm sure you've heard about at some point over the years.
Yep.
And there was a story, a mirror universe story that would have involved Shatner playing Tiberius Kirk, his mirror alter ego. And we were hoping to do that as our mirror universe two-parter. They ended up not being able to make that deal happen with Mr. Shatner. So suddenly we're nearing the end of the season. We've saved these 2 episodes. We've saved the concept of the mirror universe. And we had nothing. What were we going to do? And so I realized that I still had this idea about the Defiant being found. And was there a way to work that into the mirror universe? And it took a lot of convincing. It wasn't an idea that I think immediately popped into anybody's head as like, yeah, let's do that. And it seems a little wacky because not only is the ship going back in time, it's crossing universes, and it's not going to be too confusing. And it is pretty confusing, but it played out, I thought, in the episode, and you grasp the premise because the characters are sort of grasping that along with you, at least during the first hour. What is going on and where did this thing come from? So it was really born out of desperation. Not having an idea that a mirror universe show, and then Manny had the idea of like, we're not doing any kind of crossover here. The Defiant crosses over, but none of our characters do. It would just purely be sort of a series within a series. And what would that be like? And I just love that angle because then you don't have to deal with all of those elements that we've seen before. Your captain judging the mirror universe version of himself for doing so it just didn't enter into
grew
it
a
at
goatee.
all.
Why?
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's got much darker hair in the mirror universe. So it ended up being a really fun. Those were the last 2 episodes I ever wrote for Star Trek, and it was just incredible to stand on those sets. We rebuilt obviously the bridge and a lot of corridor and the briefing room and crew quarters and new parts of the ship that you never actually even had seen before. We finally found out where those Jeffries tubes lead to. And so it was just great fun and a real romp. And they turned out fairly well, I thought. And so that for me, that was my little. It's kind of appropriate that was my swan song for the franchise. Getting to do those.
Not a bad way to go out.
No, absolutely. So looking back now, what do you think Enterprise got right, and what do you wish had gone differently?
What do I think it got right? Enterprise, I think, was caught up in a lot of world events. Certainly 9/11 happened like just a couple weeks before the show premiered, which really just changed the world in so many ways. And it changed entertainment. It changed the type of stories that people wanted to see. That was something that certainly couldn't be anticipated. So I think the original idea of doing this sort of Right Stuff style throwback to the original series, I think we tried to stay with it through season 1 and much of season 2, but I think ultimately it felt a little out of place with the times and that we needed to move along. Television was also changing. Television was becoming much more serialized. 24 was obviously a big hit. 24 was also obviously, quite controversially, getting into the issues of the day and, perhaps even landing on the sides of the issues that I might not personally agree with. And so I think there were, certainly in season 3, we took Archer to some pretty dark places, quite honestly. And that was let's embrace it. That was the attitude, and I think we had Archer as a character who, and this was always the intention with him, at least as I understood it, that certainly in season 1 he would start off as this very, human-centered person who was distrustful of the Vulcans, felt that his father had perhaps been wronged by them, had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, combined with his enthusiasm and optimism. But there was a streak of darkness in Archer that really explored in a much deeper way in season 3. And I think Archer was in many ways a very different Star Trek captain than what we had seen. I think we'd seen a little bit of that with Janeway in some of the later episodes, certainly like with the Equinox crew. She was pretty harsh on them. But and Archer was really pushed. We really put him in very very, very difficult situations with the fate of the world riding on his answers, and had him do. We had he was waterboarding aliens in an airlock, basically.
Yep.
In an episode that I wrote, and that was a scene that I was asked to write. And that's where we wanted to take that character. When I was at the Las Vegas convention a couple of months ago, Scott had been asked by somebody about his connection to Archer, and I'm sort of paraphrasing his answer. But Scott said that he hopes that if he personally had ever been put in some of the situations that we put Archer in, that he would make different choices than Archer made. Now, Archer was ultimately successful, and I suppose you can take away whatever meaning one wants from that. Does that mean it was right to torture? Was it right to strand innocent people and steal their engine components because we were trying to save our planet? I mean, we really put him and the people, the fictional people he ran into, through the ringer. And then ultimately in season 4, we got to see how he paid a price for that. It's certainly by torturing himself over what he had done and had he done the right things. Ultimately, I believe the 7-year plan was to take Archer from this human-centric, perhaps occasionally resentful of the Vulcans, this person in season 1, and take him to season 7, and he would be more evolved, more understanding, and see the world, the universe from a different perspective. And I think we took him a long ways there in those 4 seasons that we did get, and I think we perhaps to some degree accelerated that growth of his, that awakening, that spiritual growth, and suggested that he was becoming a different person and learning on the go. But he was also someone who didn't have the benefit of all the experience and the history that Captain Kirk or Picard or Janeway or Sisko had. And so deliberately, his learning process was a very rocky one, no doubt filled with a lot of regrets for that character. And I think even now it was a bit of a controversial decision or a controversial choice. And but I think ultimately we got Archer to that place of enlightenment where he was, I think, destined to go. But it was at times it was a harrowing journey, a very dramatic journey, a journey that was a lot of fun to write and hopefully fun to watch. But we raised I think a lot of important questions. That did we fall on the right side of those questions? Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. But we were trying to challenge the characters and ourselves as writers to ask ourselves what would really happen if you were in this impossible situation where the entire planet, everybody you've ever known, is at risk. What would you do? What lengths would you go to? It's a very dangerous place to put a character, and but ultimately, I think those were successful explorations for those characters, particularly for Archer. But I'm hopeful that if ever we get to revisit that character again, if I'm lucky enough to revisit Archer again, we can show his evolution and where he might have ended up a couple of decades later.
No, absolutely. So beyond Star Trek, you've written for The Dead Zone, Perception, Legends of the Seeker. How do those projects compare creatively to Star Trek?
Well, I didn't write for Dead Zone, but I wrote for Legend of the Seeker, and I created Perception.
Yep.
That post over my shoulder there with my Voyager colleague Ken Biller. Ken, as a story editor on Voyager, he was the one who had found my script in the intern submission writing pile, and he was the new guy. He was the low guy on the totem pole at the time, and so he was punished in that he got to read all the intern submission scripts, which were largely not great. And he had called me. This was 1995 or so, and I remember I saved it for forever on my answering machine. The message, "Hey, this is Ken. I'm over at Star Trek, blah, blah, blah. I really liked your script. How'd you like to come in and do an internship in a couple months, blah, blah, blah. Here's my number." And it was just like, wow, that's amazing. So flash forward, 15 years later, I had an idea for a TV show, and I brought it to Ken, and he loved it, and we developed it together. And that became Perception, which was a show that, even was a crime show, very different, obviously, from Star Trek, but we very much wanted to keep the focus on the reality of it, the reality of the neuroscience behind it. It's about a neuroscience professor who helps the FBI solve crimes. So we had science advisors on the show, really brilliant gentleman, Dr. David Eagleman, who would tell us if we were taking a story that we found in a newspaper that day that was not real science and we were trying to turn it into an episode, he would stop us in our tracks. And rather than do a show that was science fiction, we wanted to keep it as accurate as possible. And I feel like I'd sort of learned that from Star Trek. Star Trek obviously has a lot of fake science in it, but it also has a lot of real science in it too. And I'm always trying to get it right. And the difference with Perception in that it was not only was it about science and medicine, we could make up the crime. The crime part of it could be outrageous and made up, but we wanted the medical science of it, the neuroscience of it, to be as accurate as possible. And so we did stories about, memory and anterograde amnesia, a lot of, similar areas that I had already explored on Star Trek to one degree or another. And we got to work with some of our former Star Trek colleagues, which was great, some writers. And we brought in LeVar Burton to play a recurring character. He was the dean of the school where our main character, played by Eric McCormick, who played Daniel Pierce, where he worked. So it was great being reunited with LeVar, and that was a really terrific experience. Although, in many ways, we found it, at least I did. It was harder to come up with a really great crime story that had a neuroscience twist than it was to come up with a really great Star Trek idea. If only because Star Trek was so, again, it was almost an anthology show. You could do anything. And if you have a crime show and your crime show is a particular type of crime show where you deal with psychology and neuroscience, you've got a very narrow vision or a very narrow field in which to generate story ideas. So it was a lot harder.
Anything can happen in sci-fi, right? I mean, that's
anything can and does happen in sci-fi. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
It's all right.
Can you see that? Oh, I guess you can't see them. There's maybe you heard them. Fire engines blaring down the street. I'm sorry. I'm just take a quick sip here.
No worries. So, for you as a writer, what makes a story satisfying?
Wow. I don't know. It's a little ephemeral, I think. You just sort of know. I've certainly, I've written non-science fiction stories that I felt had kind of a nice ending. I think anything that's going to give the audience, and it's hard to know as the writer if you've actually accomplished it or not, but just that sort of like a little epiphany at the end, a little bit of a, oh, where you've opened people's minds just a tiny bit and shown them a perspective that perhaps they hadn't seen before or hadn't thought of before. And I think that's always why I've been attracted to Trek and all the various iterations of it, because those shows, more often than certainly the other programs that were on television when I was growing up, the crime shows, the adventure shows, Fantasy Island, or you name it. Oh, I like Fantasy Island. I don't mean to put Fantasy Island down.
No.
Star Trek showed me a larger universe, and not just, I mean, in terms of planets and aliens and spaceships, but a different way of thinking about life, about relationships, about people from other lands. It was something that I feel was mind opening in many ways to me as a little kid, who just, I found my tiny little brain was just blown away by that show week after week, and that feeling never quite went away. And so it's very interesting. Would I have had the same reaction growing up today, discovering Star Trek today in a television and film and streaming universe where there's so many other programs and streaming series out there? I'm not sure, but I'm glad I discovered it when I did. And it feels like something that will just always be with me in one way or another.
Does that love of Trek fuel the interest in trying to put together our continuing Archer story through Star Trek United?
Sure, of course. Well, it's very funny because it all started with I had an idea for a project that's still very much an ongoing project, an ongoing concern. It's not science fiction, not Star Trek, and I realized that my former Trek colleague Scott Bakula would be perfect for the lead role. But I hadn't talked to Scott in some time, so I reached out to him via text and email, saying, "Hi, Scott. I don't know if you remember me. We worked together many years ago on Enterprise." And he had over the years said nice things about some of the episodes I'd written, but I don't know that he was aware that I had written some of those episodes. So I was just reminding him of that. Like, I think you liked my work. And so, but before I said that, I was going to, I had this idea of like levity. I'm going to open it with some kind of like fun little remark. And I thought this was again, like, I don't know, 3 years ago or so. So I thought I would open it with a remark about, how long until we see Star Trek Archer on Paramount Plus? Because obviously the Picard series had premiered not long before. And I'm typing that and I'm getting ready to hit send and pitch him on this other project. And I just stopped and I realized, wait a minute. Star Trek Archer, like, what would that be if we revisited that character all these years later? Where would he be in his life? And I was like, well, wait a minute. I know exactly where he is. And flashback 20 years earlier when I wrote my last episode for the show, I had to write a view screen graphic from the database on the Defiant, which was a ship from 100 years in the future, and it spelled out Archer's life. And I wrote this graphic and was asked to write it by the art department because there was every possibility the graphic would be seen on the television screen and people might read it. So you couldn't just throw up anything. It needed to be whatever was going to be on screen is right canon. That's how it works, right? Mm-hmm. So I had about like an hour or two to compose what the rest of Archer's life was going to be after the show went off the air and put it in a graphic. And I was like, wait a minute, wow, what should that be? And I started thinking, because I'd always had this idea that Archer might get into politics, and we knew we'd already said on the show, he'd be very important to the founding of the Federation. And I'd always loved the idea that, someday he'd become president. Well, that'd be interesting. So I thought, well, okay, I'll imagine that in the timeline for this view screen biography, that'll be like 25, 30 years in the future. That way, if they want to bring Scott back to do Star Trek adventures. He can do that, but like at some point in the distant future, he becomes president. And now here we are in the distant future, 20, 25 years later. And it kind of lines up perfectly where, Scott is in his life and where Archer would be in his. He would now be president of the Federation. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is a television show. Certainly there have been a lot of shows and films about politicians and presidential figures in the last couple of decades. And so what would that show be? So I rewrote my email to Scott and said, I want to talk to you about this other idea, this non-sci-fi, non-Star Trek thing. However, believe it or not, I actually do have a Star Trek idea to pitch it to, which I felt terrible saying to him because I imagine he was like tired of that character, having played it for so many years, and fans, always asking him, "Are you going to come back? Can you come back on the show? What do where's Archer these days?" So I was hesitant that I had what I felt was a good idea. I was hesitant to share it with him for that reason, because I really wanted him to work on this other thing with me. So, but long story short, we started working on both together, and developed a take on that story and pitched it to the powers that be over at Paramount, and they mulled it over for quite a few months. In fact, I thought they'd forgotten about us, and then finally got back to us and said, "Look, we like you, we love Scott, but they felt there were too many similarities with a project they already had in development, so which was also set on the planet Earth. And even though my show, the idea that I pitched to them, the idea that was United, I only gave them sort of a high-level overview because we wanted to find out first if they liked it. I mean, if they didn't like the idea, there's no point in coming up with a song and a dance, a whole 25-minute, these are all the characters, and this is who would play them. And, it just, because it's not like you can then take the idea to Warner Brothers if Paramount doesn't like it. You
Right.
kind of stuck. So we weren't going to do too much work, but I found, ironically, I had to do a lot of that work anyway, because Scott wanted to know those details before he was going to sign off on it. So I had kind of screwed myself in a way, and ended up having to do more work than I'd wanted to. But it was, it was great fun. I was working with Scott. I was imagining that universe and those characters, certainly his character, and where that was all leading. And but then it was, well, we're not interested in this right now. Thank you very much. And so I put it away. And a couple of months ago, I was invited to the Vegas convention and asked to be on a political panel. And it was suggested that I discuss this story that we had pitched that had not sold at the time, because clearly it got into politics, and current events would be something that you would obliquely address through metaphor and allegory.
Yep.
And talk a little about that. And I did talk about it, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. And there's just been an incredible response from certainly at the convention, from fans, from colleagues I used to work with. I think people, for one, really want to see Scott again. I think they really want to see him as Archer. I think we've seen most of the other captains come back in one form or another, with the exception of Benjamin Sisko. And Scott certainly has been, very busy being the lead on other shows. So he might not have even had time to do something like this until relatively recently. So I don't know. I think people would love to see him. The fans really want to see him in that role again. And the show is also a way, I think, to touch base and check in on many of the other characters whom I adore as well. Although the show in many ways is not a sequel to Enterprise. They're not getting on another ship and going out on adventures. It's really a spinoff. For me, it's the way Frasier was a spinoff of Cheers, where, yes, you got to see many, if not everybody, from the old show from time to time, but this would really be a different show, telling Star Trek stories, but through a different lens, through the lens of a political thriller. And it made me look back on the shows that I've loved, the episodes, certainly say of Deep Space or the original series, many of which were political thrillers in their own right. And this would just be a slightly different avenue for telling that type of story. And when I also in terms of expanding, like who is this show about, I realized I wanted to make Archer much more like Scott than he had been conceived initially. And certainly Scott is a family man with a bunch of grown kids. And I thought, well, that's going to be Archer. That's something we haven't seen a lot of in Star Trek, very little, certainly in terms of the captain characters. And so that felt fresh for the character and for the franchise. And borrowing from, say, the premise of a cop show, for instance, like Blue Bloods, where you had the patriarch of the family who had, he had like a beat cop and a detective and a lawyer.
Just a DA.
Yeah. So
still one of my favorite TV shows that's non-Star Trek.
Well, there you go. And I think it's a Paramount production, and it ran something like 14 years, and they're doing a spinoff. So it occurred to me you could have Archer's adult kids. You have somebody in Starfleet. You have somebody in his administration. You have somebody in Federation Intelligence, which I believe is a distinct service that we haven't quite seen. We've seen Starfleet Intelligence, which I think is akin to military intelligence, and we've seen Section 31, and we've seen the Starfleet Intelligence, but we haven't seen the sort of non-Starfleet or civilian intelligence bureau. And what does that look like? Let's put one of Archer's adult kids in that scenario. That will be an avenue to story and adventure. And a fourth kid whose background I want to keep mysterious for the moment. But so there was a television show there that I saw, and so once this idea having been pitched, it just went into a drawer, and I forgot about it and worked on some other things, including this other project that Scott and I are doing. And after talking about it, now it has just like come to the forefront, and I feel like I'm getting emails about it every day and questions about it every day. And it's been a couple of months, so I'm sure at some point it will calm down again. And I did myself no favors, I guess, by talking about it. But it is now, very much back in my head, which is great, but also a little annoying because
it's there and you can't do anything with it as such.
Yeah, exactly. You can't do anything with it, and it's so. We'll see. Is it something that the new owners at Paramount might be interested in? They do seem to be saying quite publicly that they are fans of the franchise. They want to expand the franchise. They want to see more features. They want to see more of it on television. It feels like the franchise as a whole is perhaps in a bit of a reset mode. I could be wrong about that. There's also a lot of Trek still in production, as I understand it.
Two shows.
So, but maybe at some point they'll turn their attention back to Star Trek, to streaming. What do they want to do? Maybe this idea, which had been, considered a few years ago, might now fit in with this new, this new administration that I'm sure has their own ideas about what they want to do. But I imagine they're still probably trying to figure it out.
Absolutely.
Oh, sure.
I've got 4 really quick fire questions that just need 1-word answers, and then one final question. Favorite captain?
Well, I've got to say Archer.
If you could go anywhere on the holodeck, where would it be?
I'd want to go to the future.
Okay. Starfleet or Maquis?
Starfleet.
And are you team Tuvix or team Janeway?
I'm team Janeway.
Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, my preferred ending for that episode, I just came up with this. I think she does what she does. Tuvix goes away, and then Tuvok and Neelix materialize on the bed. They're just sitting there, and they just fall back dead. So I think she's killed all 3 of them. That would have been my ending.
No,
that would have been the end of the series. That would have been the end of the series.
Oh, it would have been over. Everything would have been done.
Oh dear.
But that's what I would have done.
I love
Michael,
it. That's great.
thank you so much for coming on. This has been awesome. I've really enjoyed this. We'll have you back on again at some point to go more in depth to Star Trek United, if and when it ever happens. I have one final. Yeah, when. I have one final question for you, which is, Michael Sussman, what does Star Trek mean to you?
Wow, what does Star Trek mean to me? It means hope. It really does.
That's my
answer. Means hope.
Oh,
do I have to come up with something else now?
No. No, it's really interesting because obviously we ask everybody that question, and it varies from hope to the fact that we fixed everything here and went out to better ourselves, to it paid the bills, to there's everything in that landscape. So no, it's
Hope
interesting
gets a
to
lot
see.
though.
Yeah, exactly.
Hope.
It's interesting to see where people's mindset goes.
Well, I guess maybe a variation on that. Instead of hope, it means, for me, there will be a tomorrow, and it will be better.
I like.
Which is another way of saying hope, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, I like it though. I like it.
Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been incredible. Remember, to everyone listening and watching at home, you can catch up with more of us here at the Clonestar Podcast on our YouTube channel, on our Patreon, or on all of those lovely social media networks. But until next time, live long and prosper.